WVOX. From Westchester and now all over the world.
1460 WVOX.
Stay tuned now for Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and our Dina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome, everybody, to Westchester Eye on the Radio. I'm Peter Moses with my co-host, Ardina Seward. And your name again is what?
Mud.
John Sharan, also known as Mud. And
welcome back after your illness, sir.
I'm better.
No, that's a matter of opinion.
Okay, fine. Well,
you may feel better.
At least the weather's good.
Yes.
The weather's pretty good today. And today's the happiest day of the year for some of us. First Monday in the third week of February.
Pitchers and catchers report.
Yeah, the happiest day. It's the most wonderful time of the year.
What is this, a guy's thing?
Pitchers and catchers
There are
report.
women who are baseball fans for whom this is a very happy day as well. Spring training starts today, yes. But in honor of that, we have a gentleman with us who travels to a country that I don't think they play much baseball in, as far as I understand.
Boy, that's the longest stretch for any introduction for a guest I think I've ever heard.
Well, I was going to try and change it from baseball to Valentine's Day is coming up. Valentine's Day is the 14th.
Yes.
Which is Wednesday. And the segue is that since it's Valentine's Day, that we have a cardiologist.
Why don't you introduce him?
I like that segue.
Like that,
very, very good.
Dr. Joe Fulton is the chief vascular surgeon in Poughkeepsie at MidHudson. Am I saying it right? MidHudson Hospital?
Yep, MidHudson Regional Hospital.
MidHudson Regional Hospital.
The former St. Francis.
The former St. Francis. And he has run 2 missions to Malawi. He leaves the comfort of his home in Poughkeepsie, and he goes to a country where the life expectancy is 50 years. 10% of the population is HIV infected. And there are 25 surgeons, mostly foreign, who serve a population of 18 million people. So, where do we begin? What is your, I guess, why do you do it?
Well, it started way back in 2011 when I was working at the University of North Carolina. And I'm a person, I love to travel. And I was looking for a way to incorporate the travel and what I do in terms of vascular surgery. And University of North Carolina has been involved in Malawi since the late 1990s as part of HIV research and helping the country with that. And in 2006, they noticed that there was a great need for surgical care in developing countries, and global surgery is actually exploding right now because they're finding that actually the deaths from trauma in Malawi outweigh the deaths from HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis.
Trauma meaning what?
Mostly car wrecks, falling out of trees.
Falling out of trees is a leading cause of death?
Well, it's part of the trauma.
Really?
So when we look at preventable deaths right now, trauma and injury is one of the leading causes, as well as loss of income and poverty.
Now, how much of Malawi is rural? How much is urban?
So the exact population numbers, I don't know. When you look,
But I mean, is it mostly urban or is it mostly?
No, mostly rural. So, like she said, 18 million is the population now, and that population is exploding as well. I mean, just when I started going, the population was only about 10 million, and at that point, there was only 6 surgeons in the country.
That was how long ago?
2011.
Okay.
And I was saying how I got involved was with a surgical training program, because part of the problem with Africa and surgeons in particular, when you look at the number of surgeons for that number of people, it's incredibly small and incredibly underserved.
It's like one for every 750,000 people.
Yeah. And I'll trust you on the math. I can't.
Well, 55% of the people who live there earn less than $1 a day.
Yeah. So it's very few of the people have any money whatsoever. It's a very agricultural country. So most of the people are farmers. And even the people that live in the cities have some type of little plot of land where they'll grow food on. But what we
for people who don't know, I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's near Zambia borders it, Tanzania, Mozambique.
It's landlocked,
right.
yeah.
It's landlocked, but there is a big body of water, Lake Malawi.
Lake Malawi. So it's about the size. So for people who don't know, and I didn't know before, really, just before I started going there, I hadn't heard of Malawi. It's in the southeast part of the continent. And like you said, it's bordered on the north by Tanzania, bordered on the east by Zambia, and on the west by Zambia, and on the east and south by Mozambique. It's about the size, when you look at square mile, it's about the size of Virginia. And about a third of the country is made up by Lake Malawi, which runs just about the entire eastern side of its border.
No natural resources.
Very few, if any. Maybe a little bit of, I think it was plutonium that the Chinese were mining, but their main exports are agricultural, tobacco, tea, coffee, and sugar.
Is there wildlife such that they're getting much with tourism, safari tourism?
So they do have some safaris, but very little in terms. You're basically getting backpacker types and kind of. They don't
have money. They just smoke hemp or things like that.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to be going to break. When we get back, we want to hear more from Dr. Fulton about his years in Malawi and the heartbreak of being in a country in Africa with such a great incidence of AIDS and HIV, and that the world doesn't know.
And now.
1460 WVOX.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
And we are back live. You are listening to Westchester Eye on the Radio. I am Ardina Seward with John Sharan, Peter Moses, and our guest today is Dr. Joe Fulton, who is the chief vascular surgeon at MidHudson Hospital in Poughkeepsie. And Dr. Fulton runs missions to Malawi, which is a country that is indeed in need. And we were talking earlier about the program and also want to get into the challenges. The loss of electricity, the obstacles that you run up against when you're...
The incredible poverty and lack of education.
But how do you... what happens when you're working with a group of young medical students and the lights go out?
So that happens. The lights we haven't had go out. Problem in our ORs are the lights there stink to begin with. So I always bring a battery-operated headlamp. And that's basically the only light I get during the operation. The lights there are horrible. But the challenges and the resource limitations is actually one of the benefits of going there. I mean, we relearn a lot of the clinical skills that sort of disappear as we rely on things like MRIs and CAT scans. And we have to operate a lot of times without running water. The last several times that I've gone, there's been a period of a few days at least where there's been no running water to the hospital. So people have had to go to either a pump or a well a few miles away with some big barrels and load the back of a truck and bring them to the hospital, and that's what we use.
But then how does that water get purified?
It's not.
Wow.
So is it now the people that you go with? Are you part of an organization?
So I started off as part of what's called the Malawi Surgical Initiative, which was an arm of the University of North Carolina UNC project.
In Chapel Hill.
And the way we started to get involved with is that we found that having visiting surgeons there is not a sustainable way to treat patients and not the best way of doing it. So people before me at UNC, coupled with a hospital out of Norway at the University of Bergen, and with the Ministry of Health in Malawi to establish a general surgery training program in Lilongwe, which is the city that I go to, the capital city, every time. And the goal was to graduate Malawi surgeons and that they would have to stay in Malawi for a period of at least 5 years following graduation. One of the problems is once they graduate from general surgery training, it's much more lucrative just to go, a few hundred miles away to one of the surrounding countries, and they can go to the UK, which is Malawi is a former protectorate of the UK, and there's actually more Malawian surgeons in the UK than there are in Malawi. So by training them there, the Ministry of Health has a kind of hold on them for 5 years. So the goal is to perpetuate that. So starting in 2015, we graduated the first class of general surgeons.
And how many were there? How many?
There were 4. And now, like I said, like you told us before, that the number is up to 26 surgeons in Malawi.
Is there a strong sense that these graduates do want to stay there, that they love their country enough that they want to do it, or is that something that you're having to try to convince them on a regular basis? It's
a perpetual challenge, and one of the things we're working on with the Ministry of Health is increasing their pay, because there's 2 types of healthcare systems in Malawi. One is run by the government, and so everybody in Malawi does have access to free healthcare. There's 21 district hospitals, which are very primitive hospitals, and 4 central hospitals, which are the kind of the tertiary care centers. But even those, the hospital I worked at, it's over 1,000-bed hospital. So these are huge places, but they don't have a pathology department. They don't have a CT scanner. They don't have, sometimes even a working X-ray machine. And what a surgeon can make in Malawi is hardly enough even to sustain them. So a lot of the general surgeons that work there now have a separate job at a private paying hospital. And they make about the equivalent of, I think it's between $200 and $300 a month, up to $500.
These are physicians?
Yes, surgeons, up to $500 a month.
It's interesting. One of the interesting things about Malawi, when you hear about poverty-stricken African countries, some of them have very unstable governments, but Malawi has had a stable government since 1993 when they started having democratic elections. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And still with that, the infrastructure sounds extremely poor.
So, as in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa and other places in the world, one of the problems, of course, is the corruption, which has sort of plagued them.
Stable but corrupt, then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. But you're right. There has not been any really violent upsets or anything like that.
No tribal issues.
No, it's been very quiet. They've actually had a lot of, even though it's relatively new country, they do have a sense of unity in the country. So there really isn't any intertribal conflicts to speak of. And in terms of being a safe place for expats, violent crime is very rare. Although theft and robbery, anytime you're in that poor of a country, that's going to be an issue. But it is known as the warm heart of Africa. Extremely friendly people.
Have you met with resistance from locals who may resent Western medicine? Has there been any kind of suspicion about Western medicine as opposed to traditional medicine?
I have not encountered that personally. What I do as a surgeon, there's been really no resistance to anything that we do, and everybody's very thankful that we're there. There are certain cultural aspects that make different treatments difficult, such as, condom use. They really do not believe, and there's a lot of theories of why, but it's very difficult to get Malawians to wear condoms. So the HIV incidence and prevalence still remains very high. There's over 1 million people that are infected right now with HIV/AIDS.
And how do you protect yourself?
Same way we do here. Assume everybody's HIV positive, double glove. We're very cautious about sharp instruments, like during the operations. No sharp instruments are passed hand to hand. It's always laid in a neutral zone. And thankfully, no issues.
Do you feel that it will change, that your missions will change the face of healthcare in Malawi?
So what I do there is part of hemodialysis. So dialysis, when I take a step back, that's what people who have end-stage renal disease, loss of their kidney function, and need to go on dialysis. And a way of getting dialysis is through a catheter. The problem with that is the chance of death is extremely high. What I do is create what's called arteriovenous fistula, which decreases their risk of infection, decreases their risk of death. And I'm the sole surgeon in the country right now doing those procedures.
Well, Dr. Fulton, you'll have to hold that thought there, because as the music comes up, it means we're going to take another break. You're listening to Westchester Eye on the Radio here on WVOX 1460 AM and heard worldwide at WVOX.com. I'm John Charan, along with our Dina Seward and Peter Moses, and our special in-studio guest today is Dr. Joseph Fulton, the Chief of Vascular Surgery at MidHudson Regional Hospital, who's also a tremendous volunteer in the African nation of Malawi.
A real humanitarian.
Absolutely right. We'll be back after a brief Fox News break to talk more with Dr. Fulton. Until then, stay tuned.
We are back. Thanks for staying with us, folks. We are into the second half hour of Westchester Eye on the Radio. I am Ardina with Peter Moses, John, I can't talk anymore, John Charan, and Dr. Joseph Fulton, who is a volunteer. He is also a cardiologist in Poughkeepsie, and he does mercy missions in Malawi.
Ardina, you're killing me with that cardiologist stuff. Vascular surgeon.
Vascular surgeon.
I thought we worked together a lot. That's one of our main competitions.
You got it wrong.
Dr. Fulton, I'm kind of curious. We mentioned before that the average lifespan in Malawi is a very low 50 years. What sort of challenges are there for vascular surgeons or people in your specialty there?
So, with that low of a lifespan and with the lack of fast food there, we really don't see much in terms of vascular surgery, surgical needs. I really, even though I've been looking for it, I haven't seen any evidence of atherosclerotic disease, although I'm sure it's going to creep up at some point.
Well, you mentioned it's an agrarian society, so I was kind of wondering I wouldn't think that overweight and obesity would be an overwhelming problem in the country.
No, they're all extremely thin, and actually being obese is a status symbol. So it's actually looked upon. You must be wealthy if you can afford the foods that make you fat.
You're able to afford a lot of rich food, sure.
What is the major city in Malawi?
So the capital is Lilongwe, and the kind of...
It's a long way off, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The Tipperary.
Wow. Does he always have these good jokes?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. I'm going to have to listen to you.
That's why we keep tape.
So the capital is a long way, and how large is the city? I mean, is it a measured in the millions, hundreds of thousands?
So hundreds of thousands, and I think at last count it was approaching 1 million. People are really flocking to the cities. Blantyre is the commercial capital, which is where the medical school is at, as well as one of the other central hospitals, Queen's Hospital.
Now, I'm going to make a leap of judgment here, and I may be completely wrong, but besides a population explosion by the birth of many children, there are so many areas in Africa that are involved in wars. And I'm curious if the numbers in Malawi have swelled in part because of immigration.
I am not aware of any refugees or immigration status.
All right, so it's basically just a burgeoning population.
Yeah.
And the level of education of people, I mean, are people there literate? I mean, can you tell us a little bit of snapshot about the kinds of people you encounter?
So most of the children now are literate. Most of the adults are not. So they have, as well as healthcare, they do have public schools, and they are doing a great job increasing the numbers that are attending at least through their primary stages, which is 8 years of school. English is the official language of the country, as it was a protectorate of the UK, but there are different tribal languages, such as Chichewa, which is a lot of what the people in the villages speak.
Have you learned to speak any of these dialects?
A few words, and that's about it. It's very difficult for me. I think I'd have to live there for an extended period of time to have it. But thankfully, most of the time I'm with somebody who can translate for me.
And what you mentioned that there's not a lot of need for vascular surgery. What exactly are you doing? Are you just a general surgeon in Malawi?
So I started off doing some general surgery. But over the years, that need has lessened because they have gotten more general surgeons, so they really don't need me to do that, and they've got people who are better at that than I am. And now my last two trips have mainly been operating, but doing what's called arteriovenous fistulae, which are a communication or a connection between an artery and a vein to make that vein bigger so that they can stick directly into that with needles to use for dialysis, to pull blood out and then run it through the dialysis machine and then put it back in. So much preferable than using a catheter.
Now, if people want to help out, is there a donation or an opportunity with a charity or something that they can give to?
Yeah, sure. Not for me. I'm pretty much self-sustained. I bring all my own equipment. I don't need much. When I go over there, I've learned to work with very little. But there is an organization that's started by one of my friends that I made out there. He's a pediatric surgeon from the UK. He's a UN volunteer, Dr. Bip Nandi. And he has started a kind of a fundraiser. It's called Kids of Malawi. And you can find the website at kidsofmalawi.org. That's recently started. And the main goal of that was to raise money to help pay for some of the staff and the healthcare providers at the hospital. One of the frustrating things that we see is that even though we have a nursing school as well as a medical school in Malawi, that they can't get jobs. There's no money to pay the nurses to do that. So one of the things that he was trying to do, especially for the pediatric unit, is to get money raised so that we could pay nurses to get more nursing help. So that's kidsofmalawi.org.
That's great.
And speaking of money, have you seen evidence of big pharma? Because critics have jumped on the clinical trial issue, saying that there's a lot of exploitation of people in poor countries where pharmacies go in and introduce and basically run clinical trials on experimental medicine. Has that happened in Malawi?
No, not. And, most of the research that I've seen being done there, and again, I'm a little bit sheltered, being part of the University of North Carolina. And again, UNC project was started off to be 80% research. All of that's run through the UNC IRB, which is the Internal Review Board, to make sure that it's ethical and it's beneficial to the people. And they have a very stringent criteria. So in terms of taking advantage of them, I haven't seen any evidence of that.
Where does the money come in from foreign countries for what?
So Malawi gets most of its, like I said, their exports are strictly agricultural, but almost all of their budget comes from donations. And the UK, China, the United States, those are really the big three. And we look at the infrastructure right now, from what I've seen, most of it is from the Chinese. They're developing roads. They just built them a big soccer stadium, a huge soccer stadium.
Yeah, and this is what happens.
In Malawi.
And this is what happens. That I read about that. And one of the things that I find most interesting is, as our country becomes more nationalistic, countries like China are taking advantage and going into these countries that normally benefited from aid from the United States, and our sphere of influence is going to continue to dwindle throughout the world because we're giving less money to aid people in poverty across the globe.
Well, what do the Chinese gain?
Well, first of all, there's like over 1 billion people living in China. Maybe there's an opportunity for them to get more of the agricultural means that come out of that country and goes directly into China. Maybe there are natural resources that are difficult to get out because of the cost. Both China being a communist country, cost doesn't matter as much as investing that money. Is that what you're thinking?
And maybe it's a political vote in the UN sometime for something that they want that they could help out there too.
Maybe manufacturing in the future. I want to talk about traditional medicine in Malawi. Every country has its own bush remedy, bush medicine. And number one, does it work? And number two, what do they use when they don't have access to Western medicine?
So those are questions I really can't answer. I do know that it is, while it certainly is beneficial, because most people aren't being treated in a hospital, right? Most people don't live anywhere near a hospital. They don't have access to transportation, nor do they have any money to get anywhere. So, I assume it's playing a huge role. Some of what we see, there is a negative side effect, such as end-stage renal disease in terms of kidney failure. What's causing it? Certainly HIV plays a big part. Hypertension or high blood pressure plays a big part. And there are some herbal remedies that do cause kidney failure when overdosed. I think one's called the African tree violet, but don't quote me on that. I'm not sure.
Doctor, you must get an awful lot of satisfaction of helping some people who have so little. Tell us a little bit about your feelings when you go over there and help out.
I look forward to every time I go over there. Like I said, the people there are extremely friendly and very gracious. very appreciative of what we do, and I've learned a ton. I've grown a lot as a person and as a surgeon from going there.
Do you ever run into doctors from Israel? Because apparently Israel has been instrumental in trying to modernize the medical field in Malawi. And there's a member of parliament there named Biznowadi is his last name. I don't know if you ever encountered him because he's part of the big hospital complex over there, the Lilongwe City Center.
So the Lilongwe City Center, I've never been there. I have not run into any Israelis. Most of the surgeons that I've run into there, most of the doctors, they're either African, like I said, Norway, Chinese. Those have been the main ones. I haven't run across any.
Well, he's the only one, and he's not a doctor. He's a medical professional, administration.
Oh, no.
And they're one of the few countries that, since their infancy, have supported the state of Israel, which I guess you wouldn't know that, but every time I do stories, I want to see what goes on with my own people. Anyway, we're going to come back with this really interesting conversation about medical care in Malawi, the state of the economy down there, and what it is he'd like to accomplish being on this show. Maybe you want to talk about how people can give money and donate, if that's something that you're a part of. If you're not, then we'll skip that. This is Westchester Eye on the radio on WVOX, WVOX.com. This is Westchester Eye on the radio, and we'll be back when Chuck Donegan takes us out. Then Chuck Donegan of Radio Chuck brings us back.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and our Dina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back to Westchester Eye on the Radio, our weekly discussion of issues relating to Westchester and the surrounding area. We have a fascinating program today with Dr. Joseph Fulton, Chief of Vascular Surgery at MidHudson Regional Hospital, who also is a volunteer in the Central African country of Malawi, and he's been telling us a little bit about what it's like to work in this place that, to me, seems like it's about 200 years out of step with the rest of civilization. And, Doctor, you were discussing the things that you did, and off-air we were talking a little bit. I think our listeners would like to know, where do you stay, and what are the arrangements that you have when you're there in Malawi?
So where I've been staying since 2011, the UNC surgery department leases a little I'd like to call it a little compound, which is a 5-bedroom house and a 2-bedroom guest house that's surrounded by a wall, electric fence, and the reason for that is theft. Because that's the big thing. Whenever you're in an impoverished country like that, that's the big problem. So we have a guard that's there 24/7. We've got a guard dog, which is a Rhodesian Ridgeback. And Malawians really don't like dogs, so that's her name's Zaza, which means fierce in Chichewa. And we have a housemaid that's there, and her main goal, as I was telling you, I went there once with my whole family, and I try and take at least one kid back when I go. But the main thing was laundry. We had not had a laundry machine except for about 6 months over these years, and so laundry was still done, is still being done with, a bucket, some soap, a rock, and a brush. When we hang the clothes out to dry, we don't have a dryer either. The problem is there's insects called putsy flies, which will lay the larvae in the hanging clothes. And the problem is the larvae will hatch and burrow under your skin, and you have to have them surgically removed, or eventually they may come out, but you have to iron all the clothes to kill the larvae. So it's extremely time-consuming.
Well, I had mentioned earlier that maybe we'll talk about fundraising for Malawi, and the look on your face wasn't, that's not what you're doing.
No, I do not have any. I'm not a big fundraiser.
And that's fine. I was looking, though, and there are several well-known organizations that provide money, and you can specifically donate to UNICEF, KIND project, which is something, the money will go directly to Malawi. There's an organization called Open Arms Malawi, that you can donate money to. There's something called Raising Malawi.
That's Madonna's.
Yeah. Save the Children has a Malawi branch. And I'm sure there are many others. There's something called Famine Relief for Orphans in Malawi. That's, I guess, very specific. There's an Islamic organization in the U.S. And by the way, religiously, much of Africa,
They're Christian.
Yeah, 55% Christian, about 15 to 20%. Actually, 55% Protestant, 20% Catholic, 15% Muslims are practicing Islam, and I think that takes care of almost the entire contingent. There's one Jewish guy there. Literally, there's one.
It's going to be Peter Moses. That's
will not be me. Will not be me.
I'll be heading back, Peter, in a couple weeks. You can come with me.
I don't have your card, but
you can bring those brownies.
No, I'm not giving them salt-laced brownies that were just a disaster.
Well, in a hot environment, salt is an important feature that you need to have in your system.
Replacement.
Yeah, someone should salt you, John. In our last few minutes, what message would you like to get out there to our listeners about Malawi and why it should matter to us in America?
So one of the things I think that's important, and one of the things that I went over with my kids earlier, is we tend to, whenever we talk about Africa, we talk about Africa as this homogenous piece of land, and we don't realize that there's hundreds of different languages in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's over 45 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, so it's extremely heterogeneous. Malawi, in and of itself, like I told you, is extremely friendly. And, experiencing Africa, experiencing Malawi, just the expanse. I mean, it seems like the sky is higher, the air is clearer when we're there, and it's almost a spiritual journey. I took one of my daughters, and we actually spent some time camping out in the bush in a tent with no electricity, and that was just an amazing experience.
Well, what is one of the biggest misconceptions about Malawi? When you come home and you tell people you went to Malawi, and they say, "Oh man, you went to Malawi."
Well, it's tough to have most people haven't heard of it. so I don't know of any. I guess the danger. Right? Most people will say, when I say that I take my kids there, aren't you worried that your daughter's going to get abducted? But I never had that fear, and I don't know anything really to substantiate that fear. When we went over there, I'd typically let our kids go. We'd go visit a village, and they'd run off and play with the kids, and we'd talk to some of the adults, and I'd lose them for a half hour to an hour.
So, 10 years from now, I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball in front of you, but 10 years from now, where do you see the health infrastructure going in Malawi?
They're going to have a tough problem with overpopulation. If their population keeps growing at this rate, I think they're going to have a lot of problems with resource allotment. I think water is going to be a big problem. In terms of the technology, it's been growing slowly, but it is growing. The problem is always maintenance with technology. There's a lot of people that'll donate dialysis machines, will donate CT scanners, but the problem is as soon as they break down, they may be done forever. And we've seen that. It's very hard to get parts. It's very hard to get technicians.
Does the U.S. government do much for Malawi?
So they do. The exact numbers, I don't know. The UK has certainly, had... in terms of the amount of money, has been much more than the U.S., but I don't know the exact numbers with that.
Is there a shift in the disease pattern in Malawi, or do certain diseases remain consistent? In other words, are there, every 2 or 3 years, is there a different kind of disease that the population contracts?
So the big ones, again, not being an internist there and being a surgeon, I don't know for sure, but certainly the big ones that we encounter are malaria, which is still a big problem. Most people don't have nets, even though there's a lot of charities and NGOs out there trying to supply mosquito nets for people, but most people still don't sleep with them. So malaria, tuberculosis is still a big problem. Like I said, trauma is a big problem. Schistosomiasis, which is a parasite, which comes from some of the clams that are in Lake Malawi. So whenever you go swimming there, we always have to take our medication a few weeks after to kill those parasites off.
And what about I know you mentioned malaria, which in this day and age is relatively simple to treat. Why is it still persistent in Malawi?
So with the mosquitoes and with the unavailability of nets to a lot of people, and just the poor access to health care. Like I said, most people in the country, with only 4 central hospitals and 21 district hospitals and a population of 18 million, most people don't have access. That's quick. Traveling is very cumbersome. So when we see people coming to the hospital, a lot of times, especially with kids, they're coming with their whole families. So hospitals there are set up to accommodate whole entire families. So they'll have places for the families to cook, places for the families to hang out their laundry, to do their laundry. So accessibility is a big problem.
But do they have quarantine facilities in the hospitals?
There are certain wings that are quarantined. And it's funny, one of the wings that's not really a quarantine, but is for kids with hydrocephalus, which is an increase in terms of the pressure in the fluid in the brain, which causes them to have extremely large heads. And one of the things that we're talking about in terms of the cultural differences, that Malawians believe that these kids are cursed. So they don't want to have their children anywhere near them, so they have to have their own certain wing of the hospital.
So there's probably there's probably a big adoption. Do they abandon these kids who have these problems?
So a lot of kids are abandoned, and one of the projects that my family was involved in when we went there is working in a crisis center, which is places in Malawi that'll take care of infants from birth until 2 years of age, where they're they require the most care. So people will come and drop their kids off, and these centers will take care of them up until the age of 2. A lot of it is due to HIV death. Their parents will die, and sometimes whole villages are struck. So we always talk about that a whole village raises the kids, which is certainly true in Africa, but even they've been stretched to the limits. So these crisis centers have popped up.
Does the age of the children that are taken care of, does that create a street kids population? Are kids tossed out of orphanages, out of adoption homes when they age out? No. This certain crisis center, and you're supposed to pick up the children. Somebody from the village pick up the children at 2 years of age. If not, then they would go to an orphanage, and they have villages that are set up for orphans. So, in other words, the village in traditional African culture, in some African cultures, the village takes on the responsibility of raising that child. Is that correct? Is that true? Yes.
What do you think people should learn from your discussion about Malawi in just a couple seconds?
Okay. Well, that's a tough one. I think knowing that we shouldn't feel sorry, and I think that's one of the things that everybody comes back is, oh, don't you feel sorry for the people in Africa? They don't see themselves that way, and I don't see that. I find that they're a happier people for the more in general than we are here.
All right, well, Dr. Fulton, thank you very much.
Ardina, do you know who we're having on next week?
Next week we are having Congressman Adriano Espaillat, who is the first undocumented congressman ever in history, and Alessandra Biaggi, who is running against Jeff Klein for New York State Senate.
Mario Biaggi's relatives. We'll be back next week, everybody. Have a great week, and welcome to Spring Training 2018.